So we're doing church history, and so you don't get disappointed at the very, very end. We're not going to get through a full 2,000 years of church history in the next 40 minutes. We'll get through 1,500.
Oh,
you said you were doing all 2,000.
Yep, I know, but I could only get so far.
False marketing.
False marketing, I know. So we can extrapolate some things. I won't have prepared slides for the last 500 years, but I can speak off the top of my head if you want.
Of course you can.
Yes. All right, so church history is obviously a very long subject because 2,000 years has elapsed. There's a few sources I'll draw your attention to. There are lots of other sources that you could look up. One of them was the very first history written about the church by a guy whose name was Eusebius, and he was Greek. And so this goes all the way back to about the year 340 AD. He wrote the first compressed, compiled history of the church. He called it ecclesiastical history, or just church history. And he stretched all the way back to the apostolic period with Paul and John, and moved all the way through all the other events and such. It is a very large book. I have not read the majority of that book, but that is the foundation for the old classical church time frame. Now, another book that is not very often thought of in church history is much more recent, and this is going to be like the church history that you won't find in any other book type church history. It's called The Pilgrim Church. The author's name is E.H. Broadbent. Not always the easiest book to come across because it was out of print for a long time, but you can find it on Amazon from time to time.
Wait, why was it out of print?
The guy died and his family didn't keep printing it, but demand has risen, Amazon helping that, and so they started printing it again. I have a copy of it, so you two don't need to buy it. If anybody wants to borrow it, you can borrow it from me. Anyhow, he records a lot of history outside of the traditional Catholic Church history, and so you get a very different take on church history. Tonight, we'll be drawing from those sources, but lots and lots of other stuff that I have read and accumulated. Zooming in?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So first I want to look at the apostolic successors of the church. So the 12 apostles travel all about. They all die eventually, John being the last one. And there are 3 men who are looked at as the successors to the original apostles, as the leaders of the church. And they lived and died in various time frames. Clement of Rome actually probably died before John did, but since most everyone else was already dead, Clement of Rome was a significant figure in the last 10-20 years of John's life. Now, I arranged this slide the way I did because John, the son of Zebedee, one of the original 12, mentored and discipled 2 of these men, Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp is the other one. So he's kind of like a multi-fish that comes up out of the water called Polycarp.
Trying to be the Pokemon name.
I know, yes. Clement of Rome, I think, actually gets mentioned once in one of Paul's writings. I believe maybe 2 Timothy mentions a Clement.
Do we know who he was?
Don't know who he was trained by. Some people say Peter, some people would say something else.
Clement's a person?
Clement is a person.
I thought it was a place.
Nope, Clement of Rome was a man, leader of the church. I think he is traditionally considered to be the 3rd or the 4th pope. I don't remember which one in the line.
Third or the fourth?
Yep, the traditional lineage of the bishops of Rome. In those days, they didn't consider them a pope, but he was an overseer in the Church of Rome. Now, Polycarp also mentored another guy. He was from Smyrna, one of the 7 churches of Asia, which is how he ended up knowing John. And he talks in his letter about having known and been trained by John. And Polycarp goes on, and towards the end of his life, trains up another guy by the name of Irenaeus. And so here you actually have the fulfillment of 2 Timothy in that lineage there, because Jesus was the first, and he trained John the son of Zebedee, who then at the end of his life trained Polycarp, who near the end of his life trained Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is only 2 spiritual generations removed from Jesus, even though he's living 100 years after Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead.
Is Ignatius the dude who you were talking about earlier?
Yes, Ignatius is the dude I was talking about earlier. So, Ignatius of Antioch was also one of the disciples of John, son of Zebedee. And he was one of the more influential of these 3 because he wrote more letters. Clement of Rome wrote 1 epistle. It reminds me a lot of 1 Corinthians, and that is really long. And it was to the church in Corinth, actually, I think. If you read through it, you realize, wow, this is just a far cry from what Paul wrote. It's not bad, it's just not scripture, even though it's a letter very similar in format. One of the things that stands out to you, though, is he recounts the story of the phoenix, which is a legend in Egypt, as if it is a true thing that happens, which we know it does not. There is not a phoenix that returns every 1,000 years to a temple in Egypt. Anyhow, so you don't have fables like that woven into the scripture, and Clement of Rome had one woven into his. Polycarp wrote a single letter that is for sure from him. The other one is iffy. Some people think it is, other people think it isn't. His is a lot more vanilla. But Ignatius of Antioch is perhaps the most significant of these. He actually introduces an idea that is very different from what happens in the New Testament, and it ends up coloring the church from that point forward. And his letters are profuse and sent around to all the churches, much like Paul's epistles were, and held in reasonably decent esteem. What he does in his letters is he elevates the bishop of the church to a high level of authority and esteem and prestige, far unlike anything that you find in the book of Acts or in any of Paul's letters. And in modern translations, a bishop is oftentimes just referred to as the overseer of the church. In Acts 20, Paul actually refers to the elders of the church in Ephesus as the overseers of the church in Ephesus. And there's not much of a distinction made between the overseers and the elders. There's a lot of gray, fuzzy overlap. And on top of that, he actually indicates that there's more than one overseer, more than one bishop in that church. Ignatius undoes that by claiming that when Paul invited all of the bishops from Ephesus, that he was actually inviting all the bishops from the entire province of Asia, because there could only be one per church in Ignatius's idea. So what he ends up doing is starting the process of centralizing authority into the church from a group of leaders to just a single leader. And this trend starts progressing. It does not seep into the entire church everywhere at once. It takes several hundred years. Several hundred years later, you'll still find Eastern churches that have 2 or 3 bishops, and then the Catholic Church ended up undoing that, because like, you can't have 2 of you in one church. There's supposed to be 1. And then the other thing that comes next, 100, 200, 300 years later, is, well, if we have all of these bishops in an area, which one of them is preeminent above the rest of them? And if you have a whole bunch of archbishops, who is preeminent amongst the archbishops? And it creates this hierarchy that doesn't exist in Acts or any of the epistles. So that is, in my opinion, where the church starts running adrift a little bit, is in the authority structure. And we'll look at how this impacts things here over the next while. Now, the Nicene Council is a major turning point in the history of the church. There's about 300 years between Jesus ascending into heaven and when the Nicene Council is actually brought together. And in that 300 years, there's lots of Christian writers who leave lots and lots of books and such, letters, and this is just a snapshot of some of the more significant ones of these. And they give you an idea of what the church was preaching, believing, and what heresies and false teachings they were dealing with in their generation. The Tertullian is one of these guys. Origen is another one. Justin Martyr is perhaps the most famous because he's the first official martyr. Clement of Alexandria, because there was more than one Clement. Hippolytus is not related to the hippopotamus, but he is from Africa, I think. Novatian and Cyprian are other ones. And the interesting thing that you get when you're reading through these guys' letters is you start finding out like what was important to them in their generation, and you can compare that to the Bible and the Gospels and see like when did false things start getting woven in and becoming normalized. So Cyprian, for example, he's writing in around the year 250, and he's writing very, very favorably of the idea of baptizing infants in the church, as this is how they get salvation. We baptize them, they receive salvation through that, and then they grow up in the church. He was not preaching or teaching a salvation through faith. And so that was one of the things that weaves in really early, really quick, actually. Now, if you look at the Catholic version of this history, they like to give you the idea that there's just the one old Catholic church, the true church, and then other than that, there's just all these minor heresies and sects and people that were, leaving the true teaching. But that was not actually the case in any way, shape, or form. There were, in this period of time, 3 different sects or denominations of Christians, you could actually call it. The Donatists, the Montanists, and the Arianists were to be the 3 major ones. The Donatists and the Montanists we would probably today consider to be Christian. The Arianists we would probably say are probably shifted away a little further. Because they denied the divinity of Christ. They thought he was a created being, not God himself.
Oh, not unlike the Jehovah's.
Very much similar to what the Jehovah's Witnesses preach today, actually. Whereas the Donatists, they put a heavy emphasis on the leaders of the church need to have an exceedingly high level of piety and live a very righteous lifestyle. And the Montanists, I don't even remember what they taught. But it was all just variations and such. And there was a lot of disagreement, and a lot of what's written down about this period of time is addressing these various different opinions about what is the truth that the New Testament is presenting, and what does it actually teach. So this goes on for, we're going to say 250 years from the book of Acts to time of the Nicene Council. One of the more significant events in the church history is Diocletian's persecution. They're in the Roman Empire. Diocletian is one of the most powerful and transformative Roman emperors of all time. He's the one who saves the Roman Empire from 50 years of chaos and civil war, unites it under a single throne again, and he divides it up administratively between the East and the West. During this time, though, he issued the 4 edicts in the years 303 to 304, and they were really seen as a strong measure of persecution against the Christians in the church. So they prohibited Christians from assembling to worship. They burned all the writings and the such, and it's kind of funny because apparently the Christians had various writings of lesser value and were like either false teachings or spurious writings, and so they'd hand those over to the Romans to be burned while they kept the actual New Testament copies that they had hidden somewhere else. Plenty survived this period of time. But the Romans were arresting the bishops and the deacons of the church, and they eliminated a really large swath of the leadership of the church in this time frame. And so when we come out of this period, you're having a church that is missing most of its leaders, missing most of its devout, because they all died. And there's various different accounts as to how severe this persecution was versus the rest. There were 6 or 7 of them between the time of the fire in Rome in 66 AD in this time frame, and this one's usually considered to be the worst. One of the accounts says that the hands of the soldiers that were killing the Christians grew tired from having to run through so many people in a single day. So they were in a very serious, like Nazi Germany, Holocaust fashion, eliminating Christians. And then they were giving them, the fourth edict, I think, said that, and this was trying to put a positive spin on everything and say you can actually be Romans and we won't kill you if you'll just sacrifice to the Roman gods. And that didn't really win over any of the Christians. They were like, all right, you can just execute me now. And the Romans were getting tired of doing that. They were trying to save some face. Anyway, so this happens, and Diocletian dies shortly after this, actually. And then a new emperor starts fighting a civil war to gain the throne, and it's this guy Constantine. And according to the imperial propaganda, Constantine had a vision right before the Battle of Milvian Bridge where he saw the sun in the sky with a cross over the top of it, and on the cross was written, "By this conquer." And so he assumed that the cross, the symbol of the church, was going to be something he needed to grab a hold on. I think the propaganda says that he had all of his soldiers put a cross on their shields, and then they won that battle the next day. But this is the following year that he issues the Edict of Milan in 313, and this decriminalizes Christianity across the Roman Empire. And that's for like the first time ever that it was actually a state-sanctioned religion. Usually it was just tolerated, if not actively persecuted. So these two events coming together end up setting up the Nicene Council. You have most of the leadership of the church annihilated, and then you have Christianity, which went from heavily persecuted to all of a sudden sanctioned, and the emperor himself is now a Christian. And then, at the same time, the Roman Empire gets divided in half, right down in that line. It's divided east and west. And this imperial division ends up starting the church division between the East and the West that we still experience to today. Greek Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox churches, and all the other Orthodox churches are Eastern churches, and they originated out of the Eastern Empire. And the Roman Catholic Church and all the Protestant Reformation churches originate out of the West. And so an interesting thing of church history is that it actually comes back to imperial decisions by the Roman Empire quite often. So then we have the Nicene Council take place. This is in 325 AD, and the Emperor Constantine wants the bishops to gather together to decide the issue of Arianism. The Arians were teaching Jesus was created, he is not actually the same as God the Father, and others were saying, no, Jesus is the same as God the Father, he was not created. And they were arguing back and forth on this. And one of the ironies is that they decided at the Nicene Council that Jesus was eternal, like the Father, and was not created, but then 2 years later, Constantine decided he changed his mind. And so then Arianism was still around for a good 200 or 300, 400 years after that as a commonly believed system. One of the more significant things that comes out of the Nicene Council, besides deciding what the New Testament is composed of and which books are not considered part of the New Testament, though, is the first church statement of beliefs, which is we know as the Nicene Creed. And even today, if you go to any church website, they're usually going to have a statement of beliefs on their website, and that is sorting out what do we believe versus what other churches believe. And you kind of find out some of the significant theological points that a church holds to, and what they don't talk about, you figure is either controversial, undecided, or not heavily stressed.
Bless you.
The thing that always strikes me as fascinating, though, is that the Nicene Council is decided by the remnant of church leaders that survived the Diocletian persecution there. Like, the church really took a beating and really lost a lot of its leaders. And it was the survivors and their disciples 20 years later that ended up deciding all these questions. Moving along. The Nicene Council is a nice dividing line in church history, and so you have the pre-Nicene authors, and then you have some of the post ones, and of course everybody who's written anything since the Nicene Council would be a post-Nicene author. These are some of the more immediately following ones that you learn about, hear about, and have influenced the church quite significantly. 5 of them here. Eusebius, which I've already mentioned because he wrote ecclesiastical history. He was actually a very good historian as far as it goes for being historians, because he would cite his sources and then quote them very accurately. And there are plenty of ancient writings that are preserved only in his quotations that we no longer have because the Library at Alexandria burned down. And when the library burned, all the scrolls of the ancient world burned with it. Athanasius of Alexandria was another major author. Jerome is somebody I've actually cited several times in the course of Foundations for Faith. Not that Jerome, his namesake Jerome. Jerome was the one who translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin, straight from the Hebrew, instead of going through the Greek version of it first.
Oh, that's
Yep.
nice.
So he knew the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, he knew the ancient Hebrew version of it, and he used the superior text in both of them to generate the Latin Vulgate version, which is something you'll find referenced in the footnotes of your Bibles quite regularly.
Yes, actually.
So he's the author of the Vulgate, or the translator of the Vulgate, I should say. Ambrose of Milan is another one, and then his disciple was a guy by the name of Augustine, who wrote hugely impacting things. His most significant work is called City of God. You've heard of this.
I've read it.
You've
yeah.
read it.
We had to read it for school.
Mm-hmm. What did you think of his book?
It's long. I mean, it's worth reading, but it takes a lot.
Lot to get through that, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yep, so he writes City of God because the church goes through a crisis of existence, because for 100 years roughly, Christianity is legal and it actually becomes the state religion at some point, so that in the Roman Empire you're supposed to be a Christian. And then all of a sudden in like 410 or 415 AD, the Goths come and sack Rome and steal all the wealth, and it's hugely embarrassing to the empire, and Rome still exists, and the Western Roman Empire still
Weren't they
exists.
supposed to be like barbarians?
They were barbarians, but they were Christian barbarians actually.
The Vandals?
The Goths.
The Goths.
The Vandals were not Christians, but the Goths had already heard the gospel, and there was a Christian king who came and sacked Rome. It was the softest sack of all time. His soldiers were instructed to escort the nuns in the convents to various churches that were considered sanctuaries in the city, and but anyway, this was such a crisis of belief in the church because Rome had just been defeated and sacked, and they started equating the Roman Empire with the kingdom of God, that all of a sudden Augustine was like, no, we have to have a new concept of what the kingdom of God is.
Yeah.
And that has been argued now ever since he wrote that. But anyway, so Augustine was a very significant figure from those days. And it's interesting because his early life, he was very much wayward and not walking with God. And at the age of 32, he turns and transforms and has a serious come to Jesus meeting, but he's a very relatable person if you read up on his autobiography and biographical stuff.
Who is this?
Augustine.
Of
Augustine of Hippo, which is in North Africa, near Carthage neighborhood, I think.
You still have to refer
Yep, Saint Augustine in some circles, and Saint Ambrose. I just decided he's going to be Ambrose of Milan.
I think Ambrose just has.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of a certain elementary school teacher.
Oh, interesting. Alright, so that's all in the center of the empire, but the church has already escaped the confines of the Roman Empire. Way up in the Northlands, in the imperial history, Rome is overstretched, can't defend its borders, and they consciously decide we are going to withdraw from our province in Great Britain and let it go back to whoever ends up ruling it, and they retreated into Gaul. They had been there since Julius Caesar invaded in like 55 BC or something, so they had been there for about 450 years and decided it was no longer generating enough tax revenue to maintain their defensive position there, and the Celts and the Picts and everybody else kept attacking them anyway. So they're retreating, and Patrick is a Roman citizen who grows up at this time frame while Rome is in retreat, and Irish pirates come and kidnap him at the age of 16.
I don't think I've ever heard that. Irish pirate.
Irish pirates, yes. They were from Ireland, so they were Irish a long time ago. And so he ends up being a slave in Ireland for 6 years. This actually helps him grow quite devoted to God, and he grows much closer and stronger in his faith. He escapes 6 years later, according to his own testimony. If you ever get a chance to read Patrick's writing, I don't remember what it's called. If it's called Confessions or... Yeah, it's the only thing that Patrick wrote that we still have today, though. It's not particularly long, much shorter than City of God. Easily read it in 15, 20, 30
I
minutes.
feel like you read it to us one year on
Yep.
St. Patrick's Day.
I think I might have.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds right.
You get his whole life story through the course of it, and it obviously leaves cannonball-sized holes that you wish he would elaborate on, but it gives you the essence of it. But anyway, he becomes a leader in the church, and remember, at this point in time, the church is existing in Britain outside the borders of the Roman Empire. And so the idea of authority and who's in charge and who's in control is just a little fuzzier and grayer.
Oh,
And so Patrick gets a vision. I don't know if he had a supernatural vision like a Macedonian call type dream like Paul had, or if he just got a wild hair of an idea. But in 432 AD, he returns to Ireland with the intention of preaching the gospel to them and bringing the message of the gospel over to them. And this starts an apostolic ministry that is oftentimes compared to Paul's. Patrick is perhaps one of the first missionary figures in the church whose ministry resembles that of Paul in 300-ish years. And there's a book called The Celtic Way of Evangelism that I highly suggest you read if you get a chance. It's a modern book, but it traces back to Patrick and then some of the different church culture ideas. They were very much more aggressive in their evangelism as far as intentionally taking it where it had not ever been, which is reminiscent of Paul, always wanting to take the gospel where it had not been yet. But this creates a different flavor of Christianity that's officially under the Roman bishop in Rome, but is so far in the hinterlands and removed from the center of the Roman Empire that they're really doing whatever they choose to do. And they end up taking the gospel from Ireland over to Scotland to the Picts, who had not yet heard it at that point in time. And they set up a couple of monasteries that had a very different monastic culture than, say, the Benedictine monasteries and other monasteries. So there's like this original monastic movement was get away from everybody and purify yourself by staying away from the rest of the world and isolate yourself. And the Irish way of doing it was, we're going to create a monastery, and that's going to be our central base from which we're going to reach the whole community in an area.
So it was like a church.
Very much like church. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they made a point of being trying to be a blessing to everybody within the community so that they could build relationships and
Yep.
lead and show them Christ.
That sounds like something you'd find in Canada.
Maybe. But anyway, so like they were starting monasteries, but not every monastery was like other monasteries. The Southern Empire monasteries had a very different bent and take. In Ireland, they were like, let's use this cultural center to reach all the nomadic tribes that are not really settled, because it was really just adapting a solution to how are we going to reach Irish and Scottish tribes that live here some of the time, live over here some of the time, and they don't really have settled city life. So they would just create a base of operations in their geography and reach out in every direction. Very different
Oh, so
concept.
that's why monasteries are just like in the middle of nowhere?
Sometimes that's why they're in the middle of nowhere, because it was nowhere. And other times they're in the middle of nowhere because somebody wanted to leave civilization and get away from it. And so they went to the middle of nowhere.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
Yep. Okay. Coming back.
Who's the Irish Christian Columba?
Columba. He was an Irish Christian. He's the one who took the gospel to Scotland.
Oh, I must have missed that.
Well, I didn't say that, but it's written up there, and that's all I have written down about him.
I didn't know that Columba was a person's name. I was like, what?
Columba was a person's name. Yep.
Is that where Colombia?
Nope. I don't believe so. Alright, so church councils started happening quite regularly because emperors kept requiring them. And there was one in Ephesus in 431 AD. And this ends up being another one of those things where you've got a teacher in the church, and this time is a guy by the name of Nestor, who is teaching about the nature of Jesus. Essentially, he was trying to resolve the mystery of how does Jesus relate to the Father, and how is he divine and also human? And the way he resolved it, the rest of the church decided was suspect. And so they excommunicated him and said, your teachings are no longer valid. But a whole lot of Eastern churches believed him and agreed with him. And so this ended up isolating a very large chunk of the Eastern churches. And these would be oftentimes outside the Roman Empire to the east, because they were being pressed by the Parthian Empire from that side. And they end up becoming known as Nestorian churches, or just simply the Orthodox Church of the East. And this is not the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is different. But they actually had missionary activities that led them over to India by the 6th century. They were in China in the 7th century. They were the first Christians into China. They beat the European ones by 800 years. When Marco Polo went over, he found Nestorian Christians in Beijing, where the Mongol emperor was in his palace there. So he was surprised to find professors of Christ over there, but he did.
Did they have like transcription of the Bible as well, or?
Yeah, I believe they had scriptures, but I don't know all the details of those churches. They just like Chinese history doesn't pop up in the United States very often, the history of the Eastern churches does not pop up in the United States very often.
Kind of like the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Yep, and that's where we're going to right next.
Yes.
20 years later, they have the Council of Chalcedon, and they renounce the teachings of a prominent elder in the Church of Alexandria, which you'll remember is in Egypt. And in Egypt, the common language was Coptic, and so this was oftentimes referred to as the Coptic Church. Now it's oftentimes referred to as the Ethiopian Orthodox, because I think in Ethiopia is where the highest concentration of them exists, but they are still in Egypt as well to this present day.
But they sometimes just called Coptic Christians.
Coptic Christians is another way of referencing them. Once again, they have a disagreement on the nature of Christ, and the council rejects what was commonly accepted in these Egyptian churches, and so a very large chunk of churches were then isolated outside the Roman Catholic Church at that point in time. This is a little bit before the Roman Catholic Church is really fully pulled together. Part of it then also had to do with who's actually in charge. And So they had a archbishop in Alexandria, which was the chief city in Egypt at the time, and he just decided that he was in charge and not somebody in Rome and not somebody up in Constantinople. So that one ended up getting accelerated later with Muslim invasions, as we'll see. Now, through all of this, you've had a bishop of Rome constantly, all the way back to Peter, who they claim is traditionally the first bishop of Rome. But the bishop of Rome has not necessarily been preeminent in the church. It wasn't until Leo the First that that the bishop of Rome started becoming more prominent than all the other bishops in the church. Oftentimes, the bishop of Rome was called in to settle disputes and arguments and disagreements, but Leo the First claims the authority of the Apostle Peter, and therefore claims that he is the rock upon which the church is built, and so that he has the preeminent opinion on all theological matters. A few generations later, and this is actually after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Gregory I is the bishop of Rome, and he started teaching about the primacy of the Roman pontiff, which is the word from which pontificating comes from. I don't know what a pontiff is other than a Roman church or a Roman Catholic church leader, and they tend to pontificate,
What is one?
which means they preach and talk about things as if they're extraordinarily knowledgeable and have the definitive version of it. Alright, now we have a map. There we go. So, 476 AD in secular history is officially the end of the Roman Empire. But it's really only the end of the Western Roman Empire. They weren't able to defend their borders in the north, and so a whole bunch of Goths were pouring over and then taking over regions of the Western Roman Empire. They first took over what is now modern-day France, and then when the Romans marched out of Italy to go attack them, instead of facing the Romans in battle, they just hightailed it off to Spain. Spain was not expecting to be invaded, and the Roman legions there were overwhelmed, and then all of a sudden the Roman legions that were marching out of Italy were getting attacked from their backside by another army of Goths. And so they couldn't chase them into Spain like they initially intended to. So the Gauls, or the Goths that end up in Spain, set up a kingdom. Then Rome sends another army to go kick them out of Spain, and they came in from the north because they marched from Rome through France, across the Pyrenees Mountains, down into Spain. And when they got there, they discovered that they left Spain and hopped across the Strait of Gibraltar and attacked in North Africa. And this actually was the tribe of the Vandals. Not all of them did this, but enough of them did that they were able to take North Africa. And this was the economic foundation of the entire Western Roman Empire. And so Rome never recovered from losing North Africa. It'd kind of be like if you could imagine the East Coast trying to survive losing the entire Midwest to Mexico.
That'd be difficult.
Right. As you see, when they divided the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire in half, the way they arranged it is all the wheat grown in Egypt gets sent up to Constantinople to feed the peasants and the mobs and the rioters and such in Constantinople, the bread and circuses to keep all the munchkins happy, and all the wheat that's grown in the western part of North Africa, the orange part there, that wheat will get shipped up to Rome. And all of a sudden Rome lost that, which was a huge economic foundation for the entire empire. So now they have a hard time feeding armies, feeding the mob, and then you have riots in Rome, and people are like, where's our bread, where's our circuses? And it was a lot of internal chaos. It took about another generation for it to finally wind down, but it eventually left the Italian peninsula so weak that they succumbed to another Gothic invasion. And that king took the emperor's robe and mailed it over to Constantinople and said, here is the purple robe of the emperor. You can do with it as you like. No one's wearing it over here. And that is how the Roman Empire ended,
That's kind of
with a package delivered to Constantinople
He
in
mailed-
476. What?
He mailed it?
Yeah, they had a postage system back in the days. Shipping. It's a parcel.
They made our snail mail
Just
really quick.
Slap a piece of scotch tape with the name on it, hand it to some dude on the street corner, and be like, can you deliver this for me, please?
Yep. All the symbols of the Roman Empire in a package. There's no Western Roman Emperor any longer. And the East was never able to recover it because 2 generations later, when Justinian wanted to, plague came and decimated. I think half of the population died. And you just can't.
Was that the
send-
the worst year in the history of the world?
Yeah, that was the worst year in the history of the world. So if you remember back in the pandemic when everybody's like, this has got to be the worst year in the history of the world, and the historians are like, you haven't heard about 536. 536 killed half the population of the Eastern Roman Empire, and so all of Justinian's plans of regaining the throne and reuniting the West with the East came to oblivion and nothing.
There was no summer.
Hmm?
There wasn't a summer.
Yes, there was no. Yes, the sun was weak for 18 months. Crops did not grow. As you can imagine, though, this starts forming a stronger division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, though. One of the things that happened is the Western Church continued doing church services in Latin, and the Eastern Church shifted over to Greek because that's what everybody spoke. So then all of a sudden everything that is being done on a Sunday service is different. Adding more chaos to it is the Islamic expansion out of Arabia, and this happens, let's see, between 622 and 750. So in the red zone there, in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, is where you have the Islamic world under Muhammad the Prophet,
So you just casually took a piece out of Omen?
and somehow he got a piece out of Oman. I don't know the story there. But anyhow, he claimed to be the successor of Jesus Christ, essentially, and adding the Quran as a third testament, replacing the Old Testament and the New Testament, but he merged an awful lot of Judaism and Christianity into his Islam, but he picked just one random god of many in the Arabian area and decided that Allah was the one God. So monotheism was not novel or new, but his expression of it was definitely very different. Not Christian in any way, shape, or form. It's a work salvation, like many. Anyway, they expand out and they go into Egypt, they go all across North Africa and up into Spain, and they're not defeated until the Franks, under Charles Martel, defeats them in the Battle of Tours, I think,
Yep.
in 732 AD.
Is that Charlemagne?
No, that was Charlemagne's grandfather,
Ah, yes.
or father at least. So what do you think this does to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church?
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And they did lose Jerusalem and Damascus and
Yep.
the breadbasket of Egypt.
Yep. Well, this did hurt the Byzantine Empire badly. But, so the Coptic Church ends up being very isolated then from the rest, because politically now they're no longer under the Eastern Roman Empire, they're under a Muslim empire, different religion, and a lot more
Did they
persecution.
persist?
Hmm?
They persist?
It persists to today. Yep, it was generally legal. They were not persecuted quite the same way that, like, say, Diocletian did under the Roman Empire, but they were definitely, I don't know, second-class citizens of the empire.
Yeah.
Usually had less economic opportunity, had serious restrictions. They couldn't celebrate nearly as much as the Muslims would celebrate in holidays and things like that. So everything had to be much more subdued. But they have persisted. But you'll notice, though, that if you go south far enough, when the church had already gotten down to Ethiopia, the Muslims didn't get that far down. And so that's why it's known as Ethiopian Orthodox, because it flourished a lot more further south.
Yeah.
So you have this African church that traces itself back all the way to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, but heavily influenced by the Egyptian church. Let's see. This ended up putting a lot of pressure on all the Eastern churches, though, because everywhere Islam went, Christianity became the secondary or tertiary religion of the area and was officially not elevated by the political authority of their area. So the Eastern Church diminished pretty heavily. Jumping forward quite a bit, we have the Great Schism of 1054, and this is really just when a separation that was 500 to 700 years in the works finally gets formalized. And this is where you have the Roman Catholic Church excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople, who likewise excommunicates the Pope in Rome, and they no longer have any communion with one another. Up to that point, they kind of coexisted side by side as equals, but they had very different organizations and church cultures and such. And what happened is the Roman Catholic Church kicked all the Eastern Orthodox churches in southern Italy out, and the Eastern Orthodox Church did the same with all the Latin-speaking churches in Constantinople. Okay.
So is by excommunicating the Pope or a bishop, does that then excommunicate all of the people underneath him as well?
I don't know. I've never tried to excommunicate somebody and figure out what happens to all the underlings.
Okay.
So that's going to be, in your history books, the biggest separation, but I wanted to make sure you point out that it is a long, long time in the coming, and it goes back to the days of Diocletian, when the Roman Empire itself just gets divided in half between East and West. Now, one thing that I did not bring out, and I don't have a slide for, is that through all this, it would seem as if all you have throughout Europe and the Roman Empire are these formal the churches that are highly organized. And this is one of the the threads that is pulled out in the book, The Pilgrim Church, if you ever get a chance to read it, is that in the hinterlands of the Roman Empire, like the backwaters, the Ozarks, where the hillbillies are, there are plenty of really rural churches that just never got the memos from all these church councils about this is what was decided here and this is what was decided there. And they just continued the traditions that they had inherited from Paul and from John and had a much simpler form and much less organization and no significant hierarchy. In Turkey, in Asia Minor, they were known as the Paulicians. At some point after the plague of Justinian, a chunk of them emigrated north. I think they were pushed up there by the Turks, honestly, but I don't remember. And in Bulgaria neighborhood, they were known as the Bogomils. They slide over into and are found again in the Yugoslavia neighborhood in the Dinaric Alps and then into the Swiss Alps, and they're known as Catharists, Albigensians, Waldensians, and various other groups. And the thing they have in common is that the official Catholic Church history recognizes them as heretics that are not to be paid any attention to. But one of the things that historians have learned over the years is that if the only information you have about a group of people is written by and disseminated by their enemies, it's probably not an accurate picture. And so there's not a whole lot that is known about these groups of churches and peoples, but they operated completely independently of the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. They weren't under the bishop in Rome, they were not under the Patriarch in Constantinople. And they existed all the way into the days of the Reformation, to the point where some of the Reformation preachers were getting into these hinterland areas and started preaching some of the messages of the Reformation, and they would just respond like, yeah, we've known that for 1,000 years, it's not new. And the Reformation preachers were like, when did the Reformation get here? And like, what do you mean Reformation? They didn't need to be reformed. Some of them became known as the Anabaptists. Anabaptists, some came from a Reformed stream and others came from we've always been this way stream. merging together, if I understand it correctly. So then we're jumping 500 years forward to the Reformation here. And we're just going to get the big reformers here. Martin Luther, his big thing is that on October 31st in 1517, he nails his 99 Theses to the door of the Castle Church.
That was October 31st.
October 31st.
Of course, it's horrible.
Because All Saints Day was the next day.
Yep, All Saints Day was the next day.
Yeah.
And it seems like this was a really defiant act because who nails anything to anybody's door? But this was standard mail delivery, I hear, in the day. And so it was just like, oh, I have this idea. I want you to read through this, please. But that was the day that everybody marks as the beginning of the Reformation. Ulrich Zwingli is another Reform preacher. He starts preaching Reformation of the Catholic Church in 1522 in Switzerland. Yep. John Calvin joins in 1530. He breaks from the Roman Church. He publishes his famous book called The Institutes in 1536. And all of a sudden Europe is on fire and changing from being all Catholic to a whole bunch of different things. So from Martin Luther's teaching and preaching, you have Lutheran churches today. From John Calvin and Zwingli, you have Reformed churches, which would include Presbyterian churches, but also First Reformed and Christian Reformed and so forth. And then the other little add-on for the Reformation is the Church of England. And this one was over a divorce. And so the Church of England is remarkably similar to the Roman Catholic Church because all Henry VIII wanted was to get divorced from Catherine of Aragon. But since all kinds of other people across the whole continent were breaking from the Roman Catholic Church, he figured, why not me too? Then I can appoint my own Archbishop of Canterbury, and he can grant me the annulment that I want, so I can divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry somebody else.
So you just wanted there.
Yes, he just wanted a different wife. So we're 12 minutes over. We're stopping here in 1534. Once the Reformation began, pretty much anybody who ever thought that what their church organization was preaching was incomplete or inaccurate would tend to break off and form their own new group. And so you have this continual process of splintering that goes on from the Reformation to today. And you've got all kinds of unique groups of churches that have been forming. Some that are larger and some that are smaller. That is how we end up with the current church circumstance that we have in the world today. And of course, American independence really poured fuel on the fire. Because anybody can start a church. But anyway. Questions on some of the highlights of church history. That was a lot to take in, I know. There's no Kahoot on this. There's no review. In 2 years, we'll get an extended length version over several weeks, probably.
Yes. I'm present.
All right, how much is that? How much of that was absolutely all new versus I've heard that before? All of it new. Micaiah.
I would say that over like 40% of it was brand spanking new.
Mm-hmm.
Another 40% of it was like I've heard that once or twice, but I cannot recall it easily off the top of my head, connecting dots together. And maybe 20% of it, probably less than that actually, was I knew what this is already.
All right. Annabelle.
I definitely did not, like, I'd heard some of the names and some of the places,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't, like, for the most part, this was pretty much completely new.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of the Great Schism and the Reformation, but
Council
Not- I don't know, but a lot of the older stuff, like 300s AD, I had not heard.
Mm-hmm. Roll-offs. Mostly new, mostly review.
I knew a lot of it. I did a whole year of church history at Christian school. That
Yeah.
was pretty deep.
You would get a lot more new
But-
stuff there.
I mean, this simplified a lot of it, so it was nice too.
Okay.
So I knew
Mhm.
a lot of it, but not all of it. So
I I would suggest you read the book The Pilgrim Church if you get a chance,
Okay.
because I've never found that in any other church history. It's kind of like the deleted scenes, the underneath the radar groups.
Just because it's not published? Like, is that?
No, so here's the thing, is E.H. Broadbent was probably an Episcopalian bishop or something like that from the Church of England. But he did all of his research and wrote his book in 1935 or something. But he had access to all of the libraries of Europe before World War II bombed them into oblivion. So some of his sources are no longer extant. You can't do the research he did any longer because they're not there.
Dude.
And so a lot of his source material is just really hard to find, hard to pull together anywhere. And what he was doing is actually cherry picking an awful lot of if the Catholic Church thought these were heretics, let's dig in further and find out what else we might know about them, and is there any basis to them actually being heretics. And sometimes there is, and sometimes there just wasn't. They were just different and not subservient to the Roman Catholic bishop. So, yeah, you can go ahead and stop that.